This morning we're going to continue this look at minor prophets. And I don't know if you've ever thought of what it must have been like to be one of those individuals, to be a prophet called by God. I guess I never really thought of it all that much, and probably to the extent that I did think of it, I don't know, I might have had sort of this idea in my mind where they're typically priests or clergy, and maybe they are, of the Levite tribe. That's typically who they were. Maybe they are doing their duties, daily duties in the temple, and all of a sudden God calls on one of them and, gives them a message. That is probably rarely the type that we're talking about, because when we look at these individuals, they come from many different areas of life. We looked at Amos. He was a guy who was out tending to the trees in the field. He didn't have any theological education whatsoever. So many different others the Bible gives us some of those details. So they're vastly different, and some God called to give a short message. Others had very lengthy message or multiple messages over years. We have Isaiah. He has a 66-chapter book. Now, it's not all messages, but still there's a lot in there. And then he has to give the background and scenario in which it was given. And then there's Obadiah. He was the first one. He just had a very brief message to one people at one time. So they run the gamut for sure. And the thing about prophets is some of them they were given the message and they were obedient, and then they must have gone on with life as normal. Others, God completely changed their lives forever. You have ones like Jonah. We all know that story from when we were little kids. Now, he was swallowed by the big fish, but that was, I'm not sure how many days or a few weeks that whole book might have taken place. So before then, he's living life. God calls him to this really weird, unique circumstance. And then after that, we assume that he went on with life as normal. That's not always the case. For instance, the prophet Jeremiah tells us in his book, God told him he was not permitted to get married. And God did that for a reason. He was using Jeremiah's life as an example. And the prophet Ezekiel, now he was permitted to get married, which he did, but God told Ezekiel, your wife will die, and when she does, you are not permitted to weep for her. He was using that as an example. Like God was not going to weep over the lost Israelites who followed other gods. And then today, we're going to look at Hosea. Hosea is a guy who he was commanded by God to marry a woman who would later cheat on him and become a professional prostitute, take money for those services. Can you imagine? And yet God said, I want this to happen for a reason. I want his life to be a living message to the people, to be a living sermon. And not only did he have to marry a woman who would be unfaithful, God said, I want you to father 3 separate children to her as well. And this all plays into a big reason. There's a reason for that. And so I want to read Hosea chapter 1 and the very first verse of chapter 2. Again, they tend to be shorter chapters in these minor prophets. And I'll read out of the New International Version, which we have the words on the screen. The word of the Lord that came to Hosea, son of Beeri, during the reigns of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, son of Jehoash, king of Israel. When the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, go, take for yourself an adulterous wife and children of unfaithfulness, because the land is guilty of the vilest adultery in departing from the Lord. So he married Gomer, daughter of Diblaim, and she conceived and bore him a son. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel. Gomer conceived again, and gave birth to a daughter. Then the Lord said to Hosea, call her Lo-Ruhamah, for I will no longer show love to the house of Israel, that I should at all forgive them. Yet I will show love to the house of Judah, and I will save them, not by bow, sword, or battle, or by horses and horsemen, but by the Lord their God. After she had weaned Lo-Ruhamah, Gomer had another son. Then the Lord said to him, call him Lo-Ammi, for you are not my people, and I am not your God. Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, they will be called sons of the living God. The people of Judah and the people of Israel will be reunited, and they will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. Say of your brothers, my people, and of your sisters, my loved one. May the Lord's blessing be added to the reading and hearing of God's holy and perfect word. So, there's a lot going on here, and of course, we sort of have to focus our attention with our points this morning. But Hosea was sent by God to a people to deliver a message during a time when the economy was going well. And in the Bible, that's a big theme. When the economy goes well, people have jobs, people are wealthier, people typically don't feel like they have to bother themselves with God. They don't need him for anything because they have everything they need. And then what happens is there's this cycle. The economy starts to go bad. Oh no, now I don't know where my next meal is going to come from. Now I'm going to pull out God. Now I'm going to ask him, help me now. And then, he helps you. Then you get back on your feet and the same thing goes again. Now I have everything I need. I don't have to worry with God until I have a problem. That's not how it should be, of course. Yet that is how the Jewish people as a nation tended to treat God. And oftentimes these prophets were sent during times of economic boom because that coincides with a drop in morality. Economy goes up, morality goes down. Typically, that's how it works. And it makes sense when you know human nature. So the first point is that our outward wealth isn't always an indication of our inward faith. If anything, we might expect it to be the opposite. The wealthier we are, the less moral we are. There are exceptions. The Bible talks about some very honorable, wealthy individuals in the Bible. Solomon, David, Joseph of Arimathea. He was a rich man who gave his tomb to Jesus. Ones like that. So we don't want to paint everyone with the same brush, but there is a generalization that can be made. And so that's, again, last week when we talked about Amos. He was the unpolished guy who went and he preached against these elitists who were very wealthy. We had that whole discussion. He called the women cows. Not going to rehash all that again this morning. It's the same situation. He said, the problem is whenever people tend to get wealthy, they tend to focus on that wealth and then they are less likely to share it with those less fortunate. And so that's a whole other problem. That is how they are not sharing the goodness of God. When God's blessed them, they aren't using it to bless other people. Now, that's the situation in which Hosea was sent. But before he delivers a message, God says, I'm going to take you, Hosea, and I'm going to completely change and mold your life. So I'm going to prepare you ahead of time. And we don't know how long this took. My suspicion is it had to have taken probably at least a good 4 or 5 years that God was working on Hosea before he was prepared to deliver the message. And I say that because, first of all, he was called to take as his wife a woman of unfaithfulness. Now, some people wonder, was Gomer already, involved in that line of work before marrying Hosea? I think it's unlikely. I do think that he married her and then she was unfaithful, because the mirror image is God's people and idolatry. God and his people, he called them. They were supposed to be sort of his wife and he is their husband. Well, when they leave God and go after other gods, they are being unfaithful. So they had a relationship first and then unfaithfulness came. That's why if this is going to play out, if the metaphor is going to play out, to me it makes sense that it's a woman who later would become unfaithful. But that's sort of a minor point in the big scheme of things. What we see here is God's character. That's what we're supposed to see when we boil all this down. Now, he ends up, if you play out the timeline, and we don't know to what extent Hosea already knew Gomer before they got engaged. But if we are going to sort of put our feet in that story, if it were a typical Jewish wedding and relationship, they probably would have been engaged for about a year. So God says, I want you to go to Gomer. I want you to propose marriage to her. If they go along the typical timeline, a year later, he still hasn't delivered a message. Now we're ready to get married. Then we see that she got pregnant. Well, how long would it take once newlyweds are married to get pregnant? To make the numbers easy, let's say 3 months, okay? Then she gets pregnant. That way, 9 months later, on their 1-year anniversary, they have child number 1. Then if the pattern repeats, maybe 3 months later, because a woman's got to recover from childbirth. You can't be popping out kids one after the other. But let's say 3 months later, she gets pregnant with number 2. 9 months later is their second anniversary, second child comes. Then the third happens again if you follow the same pattern. So that's at least a bare minimum of 4 years to get married and have 3 kids. I think that's a fair minimum assumption. It could be much longer. It could be 10 years. We don't know how long in between kids. The Bible doesn't tell us. I'm just saying that at a bare minimum, Hosea gave 4 years of his life to God when God called him to do something before he was even prepared to give a message. And so we'll get into seeing what this message is and how the kids and all played into that. But we see here, we're supposed to see how faithful God is as compared or set against the unfaithfulness of Gomer, who represents God's people. We see here, again, with that whole pattern and that timeline, somewhere in there, from getting married, getting pregnant, having kids, she decided, I'm going to take money and take this elsewhere. I'm going to become a prostitute. Now, according to Jewish law, Hosea would have had every right to have her stoned and executed. It's the same way. Whenever God's people went after other gods, God could have completely cut them off, wiped them out, destroyed them immediately. Yet, in the story of Hosea's life, God's saying, I don't want you to do that because I'm not going to cut these people off completely. I want you to show faithfulness and I want you to show mercy to them. So I want you to be faithful and merciful to Gomer. Knowing what she has done against you and how that must hurt you. So imagine, put yourself, who honestly would want to be Hosea? Again, we don't know his relationship, how well he knew Gomer ahead of time, but if you're going to marry someone, nobody that I know ever gets married with the intention that I don't want this to last forever. So you get to love someone, you care for them, and whenever they violate that, it hurts. Whether it's, being divorced, or even if you've just dated someone and it didn't work out, there's always some kind of loss there that hurts. And yet that's what God called Hosea to do. God said, I really want you to hurt in order that you will see my goodness. When we sometimes in life we start thinking that God only wants good things for us. I'm serving God, I'm going to church, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. So God should sort of repay me for that by blessing me. Bless my marriage, bless my, anything that I'm involved in. When you look in the Bible, the people who serve God the most are typically the ones who hurt the most. And God was able to use that hurt for a greater good and purpose. That's what the world doesn't see. The world looks at God as, is he sadistic? Does he, want to see his people hurt? What is God doing here? They don't see the big picture. And the big picture is Hosea's existence is much more than the number of years he was given on earth. Hosea is with Jesus right now, because he died. We trust that he died in faith. And so for eternity, he's never going to deal with that hurt again. And so that what he dealt with on earth pales in comparison to eternity. Look at Jesus himself. We know what God called Jesus to do. His entire life was given to the service of God. I haven't given my entire life to God. Even the last 10 or so years I've been doing this, I would not stand up here and say that I've given absolutely everything to God. We can always give more, but not Jesus. He gave everything. Even as a child, we have that story in the Gospels when Jesus was 12 and parents left him behind in Jerusalem for a few days and all that. He, rather than playing stickball and kick the can and whatever with all the other little kids, 12-year-old Jesus was in the temple. He was talking doctorate level theological discussions with chief priests. Not a normal 12-year-old, obviously. And then when you fast forward to Jesus' ministry, we assume around the age of 30 or so, because he wanted to serve his Father, Jesus lost a lot of privacy. We read of stories where the people were waiting until the sun came up for the Sabbath to be over. They were lined up at his door once they knew that he could heal people. They didn't want to violate the Sabbath, but guess what? Jesus, he couldn't sleep in that day. He had people knocking on his door once that sun came up. So he lost privacy. He had to go to God early in the morning in prayer. I'm sure he lost out on sleep that we probably would want. And so many other things that Jesus dealt with. And that doesn't even mention Jesus going to the cross. That was his entire purpose in living 33 or so years with the cross in mind. I don't live my life expecting to be executed for my faith. I know it's a possibility, I guess. It's unlikely. But Jesus lived his life with that as his expectation. So if there ever was an illustration of serving God in a great way, giving your whole life to God, it is Jesus. And that's even a lot more than what Hosea did. Now with Hosea, when we look at him, for the whole rest of his life, you can imagine how people would have regarded him when he goes to the marketplace, when he goes to the store. Oh, there's a guy whose wife, cheated on him for money. And there's a guy with the kids with the really strange names, and we'll get into that shortly. Yet That's the life that God called him to. His life was a constant message, a constant sermon for people to learn from. And so that gets us to the names of the children here. God tells his story further by the names that are given to these kids. They're strange names. Even in the day, they are strange names. But we'll go through them real quick. And in the NIV translation, it's not as clear what the names actually mean. But here's a list of them here. So the first one, they have a son. He says, I want you to name him Jezreel. There was already a valley of Jezreel, but it comes from the Hebrew word for scatter. So it basically means, I want you to name your kid, God will scatter. Okay, that's an odd name, admittedly. Then after him, pregnant the second time, this time they have a daughter, Lo Ruhama. It can mean either no pity or no mercy. So again, what girl wants to be called no mercy? So anyway, we got God will scatter, then no pity or no mercy. And then, of course, the third comes along. This is a son again. We go boy, girl, boy. Lo Ami, not my people. You know, so again, I don't know how it would have sounded back then. You know, if Gomer's making dinner and calls out to the kids, you know, God will scatter, come for dinner, wash up, no mercy, come here. You know, to us, it sounds strange to us. It probably sounded pretty strange to them too. Now, anytime we talk about strange names, though, I do have to say it's not like we've moved past unique names, and I'm being nice by using the term unique. Some of these celebrities out in Hollywood, not that I follow them much at all, but you hear weird things in the news, and then you want to research and check and see, is that actually true? Well, some of them pick unique names for their children, and I don't know why they do it, other than I could speculate. I don't want to sound too judgmental, but for instance, Gwyneth Paltrow, I think she's an actress. I don't even know who her husband's name was at the time. They named their daughter Apple. Don't know why. I don't know why people hate their kids enough to name them Apple, but they did. Then there's, you know, everybody loves the Kardashians, don't they? So one of them was married to Kanye West, and they had 4 kids, which was shocking. I thought that they were married enough to have 4 kids. But keep in mind his last name is West, so they named their first child North. So his name's Northwest. Again, do you hate your kid or, you know, whatever. Then they named the second one Saint, and Chicago was the third. And then by the time they got to the fourth, they really got involved with the Bible and some sort of version of Christianity. So they named, and honestly, I don't know if these are boys or girls or whatever, Psalm. I guess it's not a terrible name, but, you know, what are you doing, you know? But that's me anyway. So unique names have not fallen, you know, out of, you know, usage. But even those names were not at the level of God will scatter and no mercy and not my people. But again, God had a reason and a purpose for these names. So these children tell a story that put them together. He says, first of all, God, I'm going to scatter you as a people. You're going to be taken captive. You're going to be overcome. And that would happen in 586 BC when the Babylonians came in. So they were scattered first, and God promised it would happen. And why did it happen? Because God said, finally, I'm not going to show any mercy on you. A lot of you are going to die. A lot of you are going to survive, but you're going to be removed out of the land anyway. I don't know, some people say Babylon could have been anywhere from 500 to 1,000 miles away. And for 70 years, they would be there. So guess what that means? If you're 50 years old at the time of the captivity, you're dying in Babylon. You're not living to be 120 and coming back, most likely. So God said, I'm going to scatter you. I'm not going to show any mercy to you because you are not my people. That's the third child. The names tell a story. They mean something. It's, like I said, it's lost a little bit in the NIV translation. Some other translations do a little better job of it. but that's what they mean, and that is why God gave them the names. So Hosea's life, this is another, I don't know how old Hosea was when he died. Let's say if he's a 90-year-old man and he doesn't expect to live longer, he's always going to remember the names of his kids are God's story for his people. God will scatter, no mercy, not my people. He's also going to know every time that he, hugs his wife, he's going to know she was unfaithful. And all these things are going to remind him of God. And, if the Hoseas ever get together with a dinner party with somebody, in the neighborhood, meeting them somebody moves into the neighborhood. Oh, I'll tell you the story. Here's my wife, the prostitute. Here's our 3 kids. These are their names. But this is the story. This is God's story. So it is sort of a point of evangelism. God was seeing through that, and it was something that Hosea could never get away from. His life was an absolute living sermon for these people. And again, all you need to know is a few specific details, and you can piece the rest together. It makes sense, God's story here. But that's not the end. It seems sort of depressing. In the end, they're not my people. Well, it's not the end of the story, though, because the reason I read up to Hosea 2, verse 1, is that God shows the redemption at the end. He says, God will scatter, no mercy, not my people, but then he says, they're going to return. Rather than be scattered, they're going to come back together. They're going to be brought back to the land. And then, because God is going to pity them, he is going to show mercy on the following generations. And where they were not my people, they will be his people in the end, brought back together. I can go back here real quick. That's why he says at the end here, in Hosea 1:11, the people of Judah and the people of Israel will be reunited. So we're undoing God will scatter here. And they will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land. For great will be the day of Jezreel. That's the first kid. And then in chapter 2, say of your brothers, my people. He says, not my people was the second brother. But now they will say, and say of your sisters, my loved one. What was the name of the sister? No mercy, no pity. At first she's no mercy, now she's my loved one. So God says there is a plan of redemption at work in this as well. So these prophets, they're not just stories. They're not just messages given to people who lived several millennia ago, and that's all said and done, and now we ignore it. Because we can see so many really significant details from these individuals. Their stories of obedience. We saw that in Jonah. We saw what happens if you're not obedient. Hosea was obedient, and all the other prophets were as well. Like I said in the beginning, Jeremiah, not allowed to marry, so he was obedient. He didn't try to marry anyone. Ezekiel wasn't allowed to mourn the death of his wife. He didn't try to do it. He was simply obedient. And then, of course, Hosea here, marrying a woman who would become unfaithful, and also to go and father 3 children with her, knowing that she is living in this life of unfaithfulness. Hosea's ordinary life became a message, a living message to the people. God called him to love an unfaithful wife, to remain in their relationship when it was painful to do so, and to give children names that are constant reminders of God's power. To people who forgot God's covenant and didn't deserve it. Nobody ever deserves mercy, but God was willing to do it. So Hosea's message, I would call it a shout of judgment that echoes in mercy. you have both sides of it. There's judgment first, but God says that's not the end of the story. It's going to end with mercy. And so I assure you that Hosea never forgot God's story, because God used his entire life as a message. God does that with us too. Hopefully we were never under the opinion that once you become a Christian, everything's going to be a walk in the park. That's one area in church history that I really think people had done better with. Because a lot of times we tell people, and we focus on eternity. If you want to live with Jesus forever, you got to call on him, you got to be born again. All that's well and good. But I think we also sometimes do a disservice to those people when we don't tell them the reality that God might call you to do something that you don't want to do, that's going to be hard, that's going to be painful. Think of the Apostle Paul. Do you know that when God called him, God talked to a guy named Ananias first and said, I want you to go to this guy who's like killing all these believers, and go to him. And he said, I'm going to show him how much he must suffer for me. The Apostle Paul's entire ministry was a ministry of suffering. But we know that he's not suffering now because he's with Jesus, because he was obedient. He finished strong. He finished the race, and he served God faithfully once Jesus got a hold of him. And so that's the message that I hope you take with you, that the message is bigger than Hosea. It's bigger than the nation of Israel. It is all of the entire world. Just as those Jewish people wandered from God all those years ago, answer this question to yourself. Has your heart ever wandered from God? Again, I know that mine has, all too often, to be honest with you. Just imagine how much trust it required of Hosea to be obedient to God. That he was going to marry this woman, that she was going to do what he expected, and the trust in Hosea, this woman, I know she's going to cheat on me and she's going to do it for money, and yet I'm still going to want to father 3 children with her. That takes an awful lot of trust in God. And so for that reason, I don't think that Hosea gets a lot of the credit that he deserves. But hopefully by this look at him, we can give him a little more of that credit anyway. And so God called Hosea to use his life to tell of God's truthfulness through his love. And Hosea's life was this living sermon of obedience to God. Obedience at all cost, to love when it hurts, and faithfulness above all else. So let's bow our heads now and go to the Lord in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this look at Hosea. It's such a strange story. Sometimes we see these strange instances in the prophets. We saw that with Jonah. None of us ever expect to be swallowed by a fish and spit up. It's just so strange. And Hosea, his life, once he was obedient to you, it was probably 4, 5, or more years that he devoted to you, preparing his life so that people could see your story. And then he delivered the message. And that wasn't the end of it, because every single day he lived knowing that his wife was unfaithful and that his children had names that tell the story of your judgment. And so I don't know how any of us would react or respond if we were called to do something like that. God, we do pray and hope and wish that we would be as obedient, but that's where the Holy Spirit comes in. So we ask for the Spirit's guidance, and we thank you for this time together this morning. We pray in Jesus' holy name. Amen.